well to work transboundary, which is not an easy thing in these areas, but the project tries to attempt that with a lot of partners in the government and other partners on site. You have to understand these are very remote areas, but I will just give an introduction, so please go to the next slide. The last thing, last year and a half, a lot of fieldwork has been hampered, so a lot of attention has been given to COVID-19 relief, given the fact that ACT works in these villages. So we have supported the people together with government agencies in these countries where we work. So that in a nutshell, presenting ACT. I will now give the floor to the first speaker. Just to remember, the topic we're talking about is protected areas and indigenous territories. What are the lessons learned for the conservation movement worldwide and for the indigenous movement? It's often two separated processes. I'm very happy to hear all the lessons learned from the speakers from Brazil, Colombia, Guyana, and French Guyana. And I will give the floor to Sandra Charity. Sandra Charity is part of ACT Brazil. She lives in the UK. She has worked a long time for WWF in the UK and in Brazil. She knows the area. Recently, she has been invited by myself to join ACT, but she has worked so long on these issues and will give the perspectives from the Brazilian side on indigenous territories and protected areas. So Sandra, you are online, so the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dominic. Good evening, everybody. Good afternoon if you're in Latin America. Yes, as Dominic mentioned, I joined ACT Europe, the board of ACT Europe, 3 or almost 4 years ago now. And after a couple of years, it was clear we needed to think about creating ACT Brazil, given the extent of the Amazon region in Brazil and the issues that indigenous peoples are facing there. So I'm Brazilian and was very keen to support the process to create the organization, help create the organization in Brazil, together with our colleagues in ACT US. And so that ACT Brazil was created in 2019, January of 2019, 2 weeks after the new president of Brazil, the current government, was sworn in. And so since then, it's been quite a roller coaster, creating the organization whilst also dealing with the various challenges that we currently face in Brazil. Can we have the first slide, please? Thank you. So before I talk more specifically about Brazil, the Brazilian Amazon and the work that ACT does there, it's important to mention the Amazon biome as a whole. As you probably know, the Amazon biome is formed by 8 countries, plus 1 overseas territory, which is French Guiana, of course. And what you can see here in this map, which is based on the Olsen and Dinnerstein 1998 terrestrial ecoregions map, what you can see here are the various boundaries of the Amazon. When we talk about the Amazon, sometimes we talk about the basin. So obviously the Amazon basin is the largest river basin in the world, which you can see there in brown. And in this particular map, you can see there's a interrupted dotted line on the east of the boundary of the river basin, which is the Tocantins River Basin in Brazil, which sometimes is not included as part of it. It's a separate river basin, technically speaking. So the brown is the river basin, and as you can see, it excludes the Guianas in the north, and also it excludes the Venezuelan Amazon and quite a bit of the Colombian Amazon. So that's very important to note because these countries obviously have huge indigenous territories and make a huge contribution to both conservation and of biodiversity, but also obviously of the the cultural and ethnic diverse cultural diversity. So the Amazon biome is there in green, and it's defined mostly as the tropical moist forests, tropical moist forest coverage, which you can see there in light green. The dark green is more of a political administrative boundary. On the Brazilian side, the official name for the Amazon is called the legal Amazon. And in other countries, there are also, ACTO is the Amazon Convention for it's the Amazon Agreement for the countries of the region. And so that is also covered here by the dark green line. The next one, please. So here, Brazil, 60% of the Amazon, almost a third of the Amazon biome is in the Andes Amazon countries. So Peru, Colombia, Bolivia, and Ecuador. And then about 10%, or a bit more, 12%, is comprises of the Guiana Shield countries, including the 3 Guianas and Venezuela. Next. So the Amazon biome, it covers 6.7 million hectares. And what this map is showing is from a study that we did in 2014, led by Claudio Marecci, who was the president of the Biodiversity Institute of Brazil before the current government. And the green, the dark green and the light green are protected areas, different categories of IUCN, and the orange are the indigenous territories. So protected areas across the whole, across the whole biome, they cover 25% of this region, mostly category 6 and 2 of the IUCN. Some countries like the French Guiana have more than half of its Amazon area covered by protected areas. And some other countries, Brazil has just under a third, in Venezuela about a little over a quarter. And in fact, this figure, I think there was a typo here, it's a bit less than what it shows. However, as we know from the Aichi targets, CDB, often protected areas are not sufficiently representative of ecosystem diversity. And this is certainly the case in the Amazon region. And another issue also related to target 11 of the CVD Aichi targets is the lack of connectivity between protected area systems of these countries, of the various countries that comprise the region. And there are very few examples, also good examples of transboundary protected areas. In the Amazon, there's a very successful one between Peru, Ecuador, and Colombia, which is called the Trinational Protected Area Initiative. But these initiatives are far and few between and need to be much more encouraged and pushed for with collaboration between governments. And of course, protected areas usually are defined through more of a top-down approach, unlike indigenous territories, which start with the ancestral occupation of traditional occupation of indigenous peoples. So indigenous territories in the biome, thinking again about all the 8 countries plus French Guiana, covers 31% of the biome, so a very significant area, and together, so more than half of the Amazon is either a protected area or indigenous territory. Venezuela has a very large percentage of its Amazon region declared as indigenous territories, and some of the other countries like Ecuador and Colombia as well. However, there are many overlaps between indigenous territories and protected areas. And often these overlaps lead to conflict due to the absence of pre-prior consent between with the affected groups. There are starting to emerge some examples of a third way in terms of managing areas that have overlaps through, for example, mutual recognition of the rights of indigenous peoples and of the legitimacy of creating the protected area in case, and various forms of co-management, and sometimes proposing a protected area status to indigenous territories are starting to appear. Next, please. So this table shows, it's part of the same study I mentioned before from 2014, and it's an ecological, it represents the ecological biodiversity of the region in terms of protected areas and indigenous territories, and then both. So in the first column, what you can see is here at the very bottom, you can see the legend there is up to 10% is a very conservative target for protection by protected areas, but is often used in Brazil, for example, including in some biomes that no longer have even 10%, like the Atlantic forests of the coastal part of Brazil. The light pink is the amount of coverage by, the CBD-IUCN target, 17%. The light green is up to 30%, which we could say now is the target of the 30 by 30. And then the dark green is beyond that. So in the first column, what you can see with the 10%, if we were to use only the 10% target, then only those the ones at the bottom there, the dark green, would have full ecological representation of biodiversity. As if we look at the 30% target, then the dark green and the light green are ecoregions, terrestrial ecoregions in the Amazon that have sufficient ecological representation. Then in the middle column with indigenous territories, it's the same. So each indigenous territory was assessed according to its ecological representation. And what happens when we join the two is that we get a huge leap in representation, ecological representation, if we were to include all the indigenous territories alongside all the protected areas in the Amazon. And the next slide, please. So this is just a map representation of the same. On the left, you can see the amount of areas, the areas, the sort of collective areas that would end up without sufficient protection. But once we include protected areas plus indigenous territories, then the vast majority of the Amazon biome would have sufficient ecological representation of the 36 main terrestrial ecoregions, as defined again by Olsen and Dinestein. Next, please. So ACT Brazil. ACT Brazil is, as I mentioned, was created in 2019, January of 2019. So it's the newest of the ACT programs. The other ones being, as Dominic was explaining, Suriname, ACT Suriname and ACT Colombia, and then the headquarters of ACT in the US. ACT Brazil, right now we're focusing on two main regions, which we call the Northern Amazon of Brazil, let's say, the Northern Brazilian Amazon region and the Southern Brazilian Amazon region. In the Southern, there was in the past, before ACT Brazil was created in 2019, there had been some very site-specific support from ACT and some work in that region, in the Xingu Basin in Mato Grosso State, there, which you can see Parque do Xingu So this work continues today, and the work in the north is very much intended to connect with the work of AC2 Suriname, with the various indigenous and Maroon communities that they're working with there. There are some thematic projects in the Brazil program now for the next 3 years. A very strong focus on indigenous leaders, indigenous women leaders, and another still very incipient program focused on the isolated peoples in the west of the Amazon region in Brazil, with the purpose of connecting with the isolated indigenous peoples work that ACT Colombia is doing. Next, please. So this slide you saw from Dominic, on the left there, the map shows the areas on the Brazilian side and on the Suriname and French Guiana and Guyana sides. The number 6 is Parque do Tumo Kumaki, which is one of the largest indigenous territories in Brazil. And it connects with these green areas, which are all protected areas. And there's a protected area there at number 8, which is of the same name, Tumukumaki. So all these areas together have more than 12 million hectares. So it's a huge area formed by both ITs and PAs. And you can see there the groups that we're working with on both sides of the border, the YY, the Trior, the Guyana, and the YMP. Next, please. So the way of working of ACT Brazil is very much the same as in other parts of ACT in the region, mostly working through partnerships with indigenous organizations, mostly grassroots. And those Apichicachi, Apiwa, and Ayu are examples of indigenous organizations that are run by indigenous people. This photo shows Taili Terena, who is the president of the board of ACT Brazil. She's a young and very dynamic indigenous leader from the Terena people, which are actually outside of the Amazon, in the Pantanal, which is this vast wetland, the world's largest wetland actually, on the borders with Paraguay. On the left there, next to her, is Ayrton Volé, and he is the coordinator of the program in the north, so the region that I was just talking about in Tumukumaki, the northern program. We also have partnerships with some of the, not so much the indigenous organizations, but NGOs that represent the interests of indigenous people, like the Social Environmental Institute, which is probably Brazil's oldest and most recognized and robust organization that works on indigenous issues. And we started recently a coalition with COIABI, which is a coalition of organizations, indigenous organizations in the Amazon, in the Brazilian Amazon, which is leading to work for us to expand our work in a few other areas. Including Tocantins, that river basin I mentioned, which is just outside of the Amazon biome, but is located in the transition zone where all the headwaters of the rivers that feed into the Amazon River come from. Next, please. So, these are the 3 main pillars, strategic pillars of ACT generally in all our programs. And in Brazil, it's the same. So a strong focus on land and territory, as Dominic was mentioning in his presentation. Another focus on livelihoods. And here you can see in the Tumukumaki region at the bottom, an indigenous community, and he's making manioc flour. And the top left there is an indigenous group, a YY indigenous group, who are supported by ISA, this large NGO I mentioned, on the sustainable collection of Brazil nuts in their territory. On the right then, the 3rd pillar is governance. And this is where really ACT invests a lot of its effort and resources really to build up the capacity of communities so that they can lead their own processes. Next, please. So a few lessons learned from Brazil, mostly from the Northern Amazon program. In the photo there, you can see Taili Terena, the chair of our board, and a number of indigenous leaders from two of the local indigenous organizations, Apichicachi and Apiwa. So a few lessons. So what we've recently started working with a consultant who, not recently, actually a year ago, consultant who is supporting the indigenous groups of this area in Tumo Kumaki to understand their rights, both the territorial rights, but also health and education that any Brazilian has a right to. Awareness is very low in this region because the communities are very isolated and there's no way of getting there by land or river. So it's really small airplanes is the only way in. That has proved to be really important for the process, the governance processes in this region, especially because of the isolation. Also, strengthen the capacity and autonomy of the associations. One way of doing that is figuring out what are the projects they'd like to develop, mostly to do with livelihoods, and then participatory planning, supporting them in the planning of those projects and then rolling them out. Another important thing in this region is creating an awareness of the threat. So things like illegal mining and of course the mercury pollution that goes with it, which comes downstream to contaminate a number of communities, as well as roads. There's a major road crossing the whole of the indigenous territory, and plans for dams in many locations. Because often, it's not until gold miners are knocking at the door of the village almost that then there's a realization of these impacts. So it's important to have the dialogue with them at a landscape scale of the threats in the region, because it's all connected through the rivers and deforestation is advancing very fast. Another important lesson, very relevant to this session, is strengthening the collaboration between the managers of protected areas and the organizations that represent the indigenous peoples in the indigenous territories. These two, like Dominique was saying, these two processes, they are quite separate from each other, certainly in Brazil. And so it is critical to start to create mechanisms for integration between these two, different management categories, let's say. If we are going to try to conserve the bulk of the Amazon, which, as we know, we need at least 70% in good state of the Amazon if we want to ensure a stable climate. And finally, the last lesson there, transboundary collaboration. So as I mentioned, there's very few initiatives between countries in protected areas, and that is true also for indigenous territories. In this part of the Brazilian Amazon, there are some very robust mechanisms for territorial protection already in place, and the feeling is that there would be lots of opportunities to engage with communities there on this same issue. Next, please. Yes, I don't think I could really do this presentation without saying something about the current context in Brazil. I mean, you may have been following in the media, there is a very strong set of very unfavorable policy mechanisms that are being pushed by the Congress right now in Brazil. And over the last 2 weeks, there's been a mobilization of indigenous peoples from all over Brazil, about 6,000 indigenous peoples have been camped in front of the Congress in Brasilia, in the capital. The strategic reason for this now is that this, the first thing that you see there on the top of the list, these PLs are law projects, so they are being discussed in Congress right now. The first one there, 490, is a very, potentially very damaging piece of legislation if it gets approved, because it would formalize the so-called marco temporal, which is a sort of, it's a cutoff date for demarcation. The constitution in Brazil was voted and approved, was approved in 1988. And what it says is that indigenous peoples have a right to their ancestral lands. So this cutoff date, this PL 490 would establish a new cutoff date for demarcation of new areas, or for extending existing indigenous territories that have lost area due to invasions by mining, by cattle ranching, and other pressures that have encroached on their land. So it would be virtually impossible to create new indigenous territories if this law goes ahead. There's a vote now currently being discussed by the Supreme Court in Brazil, and it's been postponed twice already since 2 weeks ago. So this is all very live now. The other PLs you can see there, one would approve gold mining, and this the 191 would approve gold mining inside indigenous territories. 510 it would pretty much legalize land grabbing. And it was proposed by the Senate. The one below it was proposed, is the same, it's for land grabbing, and it was proposed by the lower house. So these are all very, very concerning. This is a very concerning time for indigenous peoples, and protected areas in Brazil, as well as for the climate, for the global climate, given the implications for extended deforestation. Next, please. So here, just a few of some of the main challenges. As I mentioned, the marco temporal is this cutoff date that is currently in the process of being voted. It's now being pushed to next week, the vote, Wednesday next week. PL 490 is the same, but it's a mechanism pushed through the Congress as opposed to the Supreme Court. The third bullet there is on illegal gold mining. A study that just came out just last week showing that in the last 35 years, illegal gold mining has increased by 500% inside indigenous territories and 300% inside protected areas. As I mentioned, the proposed legalization of gold mining inside indigenous territories would be PL 191, and then the land grabbing bills. Next, please. So to try and be a little less gloomy about the prospects, which are very grave, I think it's important to just really remember, and this is where I feel it's important to mention a few things that potentially, what can the world learn from the evolution of protected areas and indigenous territories in Brazil? If we think that we know that land is really the connection between indigenous peoples and their culture and their survival, their spirituality, the languages, and their sustainable economies. So once you take the land away, those bubbles, they just became bubbles, and those people no longer exist as indigenous peoples. So Marcos Terena, which is the quote there, he is a founding member he's also from the Terena people, and he's a founding member of the ACT Brazil. And he always says that, the struggle of indigenous peoples is that, what they ambition is to travel forwards, so travel towards the future along the paths created by the past, by their ancestors. He belongs to the Xané indigenous nation, but it's also known as the Terena in the Mato Grosso do Sul state in Brazil, where the Pantanal is. He's won numerous prizes. He's been involved in a number of creation of a number of groups, including the Intertribal Committee for Indigenous Memory, which was one of the Brazilian organizations that that organized the games, World Games of Indigenous People during the Olympics in Brazil in 2015. And he was involved, advised on about 80% of the demarcations of indigenous territories in Brazil, and also advised on the Indigenous Peoples Chapter in the Constitution. He's going to be in Glasgow at the COP26 of the Climate Convention, and is a very prominent leader, Indigenous leader in Brazil. So as I said, I think what the world can really learn from the experience of Brazil with indigenous territories and protected areas is the importance of of integrating those two processes between the creation of protected areas and the creation of and demarcation of indigenous territories. A second thing that people really need to focus on, just related to protected areas, is the need to really ensure ecological representation of those areas, as many are still not well managed and often are also not connected in a sort of integrated, connected protected area system. In terms of indigenous peoples, it would really help them to understand their legal context and rights in places like in the Amazon region, where communities are very isolated, and also to help the world understand their thinking and their perspective, which we sort of know, but by and large, people don't really know what the thinking is behind the designation of an indigenous territory for a particular indigenous ethical group, certainly in Brazil. That's it. Thank you very much for listening. Final slide.
Thank you very much, Sandra, for this enlightening and ideas. I think you set the scene for discussion, interaction, reflections from the largest country in the Amazon, Brazil. Thank you so much. We have gone a little bit over time. I have a lot of questions for you, Sandra, but I would like to give the floor to the audience to just ask you one question regarding Brazil and protected areas, indigenous territories. There's someone who wants to stand up and go to the microphone and ask a question to Sandra before we go to the second speaker. Thank you.
So, thanks for the presentation. And my question would be, how do you relate your work with the CSP Commission, for instance, and how do you engage also with maybe the private sector, maybe to reinforce this type of governance and maybe change from a financial economy toward a more realistic economy, which is not totally financial? Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry, can you just, the CSB committee?
He mentions the IUCN committee, CESP.
Oh, CESB, okay, sorry, I missed that. I'll answer the other two questions. I'm not fully familiar with the work of the CSB committee. In terms of the private sector, it's tough. It's tough in Brazil. Brazil exports agro-commodities on a very large scale. There are areas where it's possible to work with indigenous, where the private sector can work with trying to harmonize their activities with indigenous peoples, but by and large, it is a struggle and a challenge. There are organizations working with a number of companies in various supply chains of commodities, agro-commodities in Brazil, like soy and beef, which are the main ones at the moment, especially beef in the Amazon region. And these organizations are working with the private sector to include safeguards, social and environmental safeguards, to reduce the risk of deforestation from their activities in that region. So I think it'll come. There are pressures, for example, I know that I read today, President Macron has been very vocal on the difficulties he sees with signing the Mercosur agreement, trade agreement, which is the trade agreement in the south of South America, including Brazil, and for a reason, and he's right really to be concerned, because that would open the floodgates to, much more liberalization of the trade of agro-commodities between these countries, Brazil and Argentina especially, and the EU. So it's important that the EU countries really push for due diligence processes and systems to ensure that the commodities that European countries are importing are not causing deforestation, are not breaching the rights of indigenous peoples and affecting indigenous territories, or affecting and impacting protected areas. In terms of the financial economy, I don't know, if you mean Brazil, then it's so buoyant. Commodities are a huge part of Brazil's exports, and to turn that ship will take some time. I think, again, there's a carrot and there's a stick. So the stick really can be offered by financial institutions around the world who are investing in agricultural in agriculture in countries like Brazil. So things like green finance, and there are a number of mechanisms all appearing now that can help to sort of clean up. It starts with the investors, doesn't it? And then trickles down. So I think in the fullness of time, countries that at the moment, Brazil is very resistant to any mechanism really that can create obstacles to exports of agro-commodities. But in the fullness of time, it will be possible to have this carrot and stick effect if we are able to, at a global level, increase the focus of investors on deforestation-free and human rights-free commodity exports.
Thank you so much, Sandra. We have gone a little bit out of time. I will present the second speaker to you, which is from Colombia. He's Colombian national. His name is Isidoro Hasbun. He works for ACT US. He's a policy advisor, has tremendous knowledge on Colombia, his country, and he will present us in 15 minutes perspectives from Colombia. Isidoro, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dominic. Great seeing you. And thank you everyone for joining us in this event. So before going to the first slide, just wanted to say something that a local partner recently mentioned to us as we are ongoing a strategic planning process for the next years. And is that ACT is not just an organization, but a deep and strategic idea. It really is, in essence, an idea of promoting indigenous rights in conservation, in management and ownership of their lands that really stems not only 25 years, but 80 years in the making since the mentors and predecessors of the founders of our organization. So next slide, please. Next slide. just a brief context. I'm gonna go first a little bit into the geography here, since the presentation originally was going to be about the Guiana Shields, but most people really don't see Colombia as a Guyanese country. It is the least known of the Guianas, but in reality, it's about 20% of the country's territory. Next slide, please. I want to highlight two main features among many in the Guianas of Colombia that are fundamental to understand the region. One is the Rio Negro, the largest left tributary of the Amazon River, the largest blackwater river in the world, and one of the world's 10 largest rivers by average discharge, begins in the Colombian Guyana. And the second is the Chiribiquete Plateau, of which it incorporates the Chiribiquete National Natural Park, one of the cornerstones of the Colombia's national park system, the largest national park by far of Colombia, close to a little bit over 4 million hectares, with average elevations of 900 meters, and forms the western edge of the shield, and conglomerates the Andean Amazon transition region, the Amazon lowlands, and the Orinoco Guiana Shield region. But to better understand the role of indigenous peoples in protected areas in Colombia, I would like to go to a national scale summary and overview. Next slide, please. So here it's just a brief overview of the Colombian National Protected Area System. It is the set of the Colombian National Protected Area System, as you can see from the different shades and colors. It is a set of protected areas, management strategies, and instruments that contribute to the conservation of the country's conservation objective. It includes all protected areas, public, private, national, regional, and the National Protected Area System of Colombia was established in 1994 after the country signed the Convention on Biological Diversity. About 18 million of the National Protected Area System is on land. That means approximately 15% of the country is considered protected area, whether regional, local, or national in scale. The National Parks Unit manages those protected areas in the system that are national in scale. Those are the national natural parks like Chiribiquete, which I briefly mentioned, fauna and flora sanctuaries, unique natural areas, national natural reserves, and parkways. There are 59 of those across the country. Those are the ones in yellow, as you can see. And those are also amount to about 15 million hectares within the 18 million hectares within the national system. So next slide, please. Here, our friends of Parque Nacionales Como Vamos shared a recent report on the status of national parks and had this really informative maps showcasing the indigenous reserves as well as Afro-Colombian community lands that overlap or are located near national parks. There are about 800 indigenous reserves in Colombia with amounting to 32 million hectares, about 30% of the national area, close to. And they are inalienable and imprescriptible, which means that they can't be sold or purchased, or they can't be taken away. They are permanent. They range from very large ones, such as Predio Putumayo in the south of Colombia, that is about 6 million hectares, larger than even Chiribiquete National Park, which is the largest tropical national park in the world, to micro reserves of 1 to 2 hectares or less. Of note, indigenous reserves are fundamental for conservation because more than 90% of their lands are forested, meaning that there is little to no deforestation in these areas in Colombia. Recent evidence is showcased. On the Afro-Colombian communities, most are located in the Pacific, and they were established through Law 70 of 1993. These are about 5 to almost 6 million hectares. And this is really a unique aspect of the Colombian legal system. It set a historic precedent around the region. Colombia was the first country to encode the ability for non-indigenous ethnic minorities to receive collective land title, including Afro-descendant communities in the Amazon and Pacific coast. And it created a legal pathway for Afro-Colombian communities to receive collective titles to historically occupied territories in rural river basin areas. So what does this show? It shows that 38 million hectares, that is more than 30%, about a third of the land of Colombia, is within collective title, collective ownership. More than twice the size of protected areas in land categories that are land, not oceanic or maritime. About 18 million of those hectares within the protected area system as well are collective titles. That means that protected area systems overlap with collective ownership, indigenous reserves, and Afro-Colombian communities. 23 national parks overlap with indigenous reserves, with about 40 indigenous reserves, and 8 national parks overlap with Afro-Colombian lands. Next slide. So I'm going to just go through an overview of the work that ACT has done in the last 25 years to promote indigenous-led conservation of protected areas through strengthening of this management of these protected areas, as well as the creation itself of protected areas through the leadership of indigenous peoples. Next slide, please. This is the Frago River in the Andean Amazon and tropical Andes, the most biodiverse region on the planet, the source of the headwaters of the Amazon. In 1996, inspired by the legacy of Richard Evans Schultes, who is one of the mentors of our founders, as Dominique showcased in the earlier presentation. He really saw and encountered the extraordinary world of shamans and sacred plants, began his work in this region. And through a broader view of ethnobotany, the team understood the importance with respect to conservation of integrating and recognizing indigenous knowledge. Less tangible, perhaps, related to spiritual connections, voices from the rainforest, and traditional forms and approaches that are tied with land and territory of indigenous peoples. Under the guidance of the traditional healers and knowledge keepers of the 5 indigenous peoples of Yahe, which are the Inga, Sionas, Kofan, Coreguaje, and Kamsha, ACT supported the formation of the Union of Indigenous Yahe Healers of the Colombian Amazon, Umiyak, and the Tandachirido Inganokuna Association of the Inga people of Caquetá, who promoted the creation of Indihuasi National Park. Indihuasi means house of the sun, and it was a pioneering protected area that applied this approach of co-management. Next slide, please. I want to go with a brief quote from the Ingas of Caquetá, who supported the creation of this park. It says, "For us, the word park does not cover everything that our territory signifies. It does not reflect our medicine, the spirits, the hunting grounds, the salt licks. We wanted from the beginning to use the word Nuncanchipa Alpa, our land, because park for us is the central square of a community." In other words, although the word conservation does not exist in a language, this word could make sense if it was expressed through Nuncanchipa Alpa. Conservation for non-indigenous people is done in a park. And these are the healers and and members of ACT and the Tandachirido Association who led the creation of the park. The declaration was complex. It incorporated new forms of dialogues, and it culminated in the declaration of 72,000 hectares under the category of protected area in 2002. So this declaration was of note for three pioneering aspects at that time. It's really a pioneering concept in the early 2000s. The declaration was requested and promoted by an indigenous community for the protection of their ancestral territory. It recognized the importance of conservation beyond biological criteria that integrated cultural aspects within the conservation objectives. And it introduced a new category for the management of protected areas, co-management between National Parks Unit and the Chirido Nganokuna Indigenous Association. With this mandate, the mandate of the traditional healers was fulfilled to protect their ancestral territory, sacred sites, and all the substratum related to the Yahe culture against the threat of the petroleum extraction industry, illicit crops, and the expansion of the agricultural frontier, among other perils. Next slide, please. In 2008, in partnership with the indigenous communities of Putumayo, the Colombian government established another area of the Amazon rainforest as a nationally protected category for the primary purpose of preserving medicinal plants. The new protected area is Orito Ingiandi Medicinal Flora Sanctuary. This 10,000 hectare sanctuary really supports the traditional use of various indigenous peoples, among which we highlight the Kofan, Inga, Siona, Kamsan, Koreguaje peoples. This is the culture of Yahe again, which is one of the strongest shamanic traditions that currently exist on the planet. This is the space in which the indigenous peoples that make up this culture, and especially the Kofan people, can develop their traditions, contributing to the permanence of traditional medicinal systems and the recovery of associated tangible and intangible heritage. Next slide, please. Now, here I want to highlight some of the work connected to the lowland Amazon. In Colombia, now on the formal side of things, there are some management schemes called regímenes especiales de manejo. These are special management regimes, which are agreements for the management of overlapping areas in Colombia that provided by Decree 622 of 1977, when indigenous reserves and national parks overlap. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, about 23 parks overlap with indigenous reserves, but only 9 so far have established regímenes especiales de manejo. And we're working in the Kawinari Indigenous Reserve in the lowland Amazon, articulating our work between the Rio Puré National Park, the Kawinari National Park. Those two amount to 1.5 million hectares. Ati, Aipea, and Pani indigenous community associations related to the protection of indigenous peoples living in voluntary isolation, like Sandra mentioned in the previous presentation, and the creation of a contingency plan in case of initial contact with these indigenous peoples living in voluntary isolation. Next slide, please. So I just want to highlight this work, which is fundamental for these regímenes, the promotion of these regímenes especiales de manejo en Kawinari. ACT in 2008, although the work really was a decades-long effort, was able to promote the Decree 1232 by the Colombian government, which it was issued for the prevention of harm and protection of the rights of isolated peoples in Colombia. These indigenous peoples are extremely vulnerable to disease and encroachment to their lands. And these are the last peoples that depend 100% on their forests. In Colombia, there's officially recognized one group, which can be divided into two, the Yuri Pase. Interestingly enough, these are Tikuna speaking linguistically, and the neighboring communities are Yukuna speaking, meaning that part of the work related to the contingency plan was training Tikuna speaking individuals to be able to, or linguistic family, to be able to support the emergency when these communities come out. Also in the Guiana Shield, ACT along the border with Venezuela supported the creation of a 95,000 hectare Nacuanedoro Indigenous Reserve for the Mapayerri people, which are indigenous peoples in initial contact, meaning that they are just leaving their state of uncontacted state of isolation in the last generations, and they are semi-nomadic. These reserves provides the Mapayerri with the land necessary to continue their semi-nomadic way of life without interference. And it constituted the basis for ACT's drafting of the first set of comprehensive guidelines for the protection of these peoples in Colombia. Next slide, please. Now we're going to the Caribbean region of Colombia. Most people look at this image and do not believe this is in the Caribbean, just less than 100 kilometers away from the Caribbean Sea. But in reality, the tallest mountains in Colombia are located in the Caribbean coast, in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta. Most of the reserves in these areas, which are owned by the Kogi, Wiwa, Arhuaco, and Cancuamo peoples, overlap with the Sierra Nevada National Park, about 300,000 hectare national park. Next slide, please. ACT supported the community in promotion of the Decree 1500 of 2018, which promotes the coherence and promotes the strengthening of the Línea Negra around the Sierra Nevada National Park. As you can see from this map, these are the 3 indigenous reserves in purple, red, and green, and sacred sites are surrounding this Colombian coastal mountain range. Next slide, please. We supported the Kogi community in establishing or restoring one of these sacred sites beginning in 2010. In 2013, we supported the Kogi in purchasing a sacred site called Havatanihuashcaca. As of today, this site of the Línea Negra amounts to 250 hectares close, and it really has been an example of restoration of ecosystems led by indigenous peoples close by to the Sierra Nevada National Park. It shows a great example of restoration led by indigenous peoples in the last decade or so, and how quickly ecosystems can be restored if they are given time to recover their ecosystemic features. Next slide, please. My last slide. This is of note because while not being some of them not being in a protected area, ACT has been a leader in the country in the support of indigenous peoples' efforts to title their lands through the resguardos indígenas, like I showcased at the start of the presentation. In the last 10 years, ACT has been fundamental to the titling of close to half of the indigenous reserves in Colombia in terms of land. So it's been really a fundamental actor in the space in the last decade through our partnerships with the Colombian National Land Agency and other entities within the Colombian government. So about 1 million hectares have been titled with indigenous peoples and support by ACT. Of note, some of those are in protected areas. And that really has been because the national park system has asked for ACT to support the establishment of these reserves due to, in some cases, low capacity by the national park system to control and protect these ecosystems. So there's kind of an overlap there in some cases. But in others, it does really show that our strategy, while not being formally a protected area, it is really fundamental for the conservation of ecosystems and the restoration of these landscapes. And that's it. Thank you, merci. Merci beaucoup. And happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Isidoro. What a fascinating country you live in. It's really unbelievable. I think the world can learn so much from your country, especially on the issues you mentioned, overlap, protected areas, indigenous reserves. I have a million of questions. We are long over time. We still have some drinks and we still have 2 speakers. So I would like to reserve the questions for the end, unless somebody has a burning question now, then he takes the mic. If not, I would like to go to the next speaker and then have the questions at the end. The next speaker is from Guyana. Her name is Jessica George. She is here with us. Jessica is a Mapuche from Guyana with an insight in these issues from her own life, but also because Jessica has worked for the Protected Areas Commission in Guyana. So she can look at that issue from both angles, and we're very interested to hear Jessica's perspectives on indigenous territories and protected areas in Guyana, and what the world can learn from Guyana. Jessica.
Good afternoon or good day, wherever you are. Okay. So yes, I've worked with the Protected Areas Commission in Guyana, and I'm also an indigenous person. So that makes 2 things that would help in this presentation. So the first slide, please. So this is the country of Guyana. And if you notice it, you have the ones in the brown and the ones in the green. And it tells you about the brown, it tells you about the 9 different people, indigenous peoples living in Guyana and or in villages. And all of that makes up 14% of the country's land mass. And in the green, you have 5 protected areas in Guyana, and it makes up 12% of the land mass. The one to the bottom of the map, it's the Conishan Amerindian protected area. At present, it holds just over 3% of Guyana's land mass, and it is managed by the indigenous peoples, the YYs, totally. Now, for Guyana, a lot of lessons can be learned, and there's a lot of history. We know that Guyana has one of the oldest protected areas in South America that happened in 1929. Then the Kaieteur National Park in the middle of Guyana. Next slide, please. So this may be a very strange slide to show at a presentation like this, but I would like to bring to your attention that without organizations, whether they be government, NGOs, donor agencies, and also indigenous advocacy group. The work of protected areas could not go on. Somebody had to take the first step in creating protected areas. And for some of our protected areas, you have indigenous peoples that made the first step, which is a plus for creating a protected area, because one of the main ideas is to have those areas as it is for future generations. Next slide, please. So in creating protected areas in Guyana, each protected area that we look at, it is different. It has a different, it has many different things in it. It's not the same. It has the special things that you would not find in any other of the protected areas. We have the coastal protected area, and then you have one as deep in the middle of the forest with rivers and mountains. And then you have another one with one of the greatest waterfalls in the world. And then you have one that is, that holds the headwaters of the third largest river in the South America, the Essequibo. And also it is managed by the people themselves, the indigenous peoples. So that is many different reasons. They have different characteristics then. And in creating protected areas in Guyana, there's a legal law that says, that recognizes the contributions of the indigenous peoples. It recognizes that protected areas cannot be there as it is without the contributions of the indigenous peoples. And also their management systems are unique. In Guyana, we have, as I mentioned, government manages at least 3 of those protected areas. One of them is a gift to the Commonwealth, managed by an international body. And also the next one is managed by the indigenous peoples themselves. Next slide, please. So process during the creation, things to pay attention to, or that I need to bring your attention to, is that there were indigenous advocacy groups that were against the creation of new protected areas in the country, and claiming that their lands would be taken away from them, but that was not so. We can see it now, and those protected areas were created. Then while for some of the protected areas, you had really good consultations, because those protected areas were created with calls from the indigenous peoples themselves. Other protected areas, it was not so, due to inadequate funding and technical personnel to carry out all of these works. A next thing to pay attention to is the protected areas. In each process, it took a very long time to meet the final product of the creation of a protected area. The process sometimes lasts over 10 years, and the people that you're working with becomes very, very tired of hearing one thing, and just you sitting there for about 45 minutes, you're getting tired, but people waited for a whole 10 years just to hear the creation of a protected area. So it's very tiring. One of the next things also is when you put, when the management system is in place, it makes it very, very difficult to get the people to want the protected areas again. So you have to go back now in the process of educating them or making them aware of why these protected areas was created in the first place, because by that time, those that were young has grown up and probably forgotten the whole process. The next one was leaders in these communities also change. And the leader at that time that might have signed things may not be there anymore. And then you have to change or bring that to the forefront of the leadership of the village. And usually people follow the leaders. So it makes it very, very difficult for the managers or the management system that is put in place. So next slide, please. So what exactly is happening now with all the process that has happened? Jobs were provided with dedicated staff from communities or the indigenous communities from around the protected area. You have, I was one of those staff. That's why Dominic mentioned I used to work with the Protected Areas Commission. So people that have followed the process and are very dedicated are working in these protected areas to continue the work that has started so many years ago. And the indigenous peoples, with the creation of these protected areas, I must say that the indigenous peoples are allowed to continue their traditional practices, gathering resources in a sustainable manner, so that what was going on for years will continue and the resources will remain for a very long time in the future. And also now, it is, all of these protected areas are protected by legal laws from illegal activities happening in these protected areas. Next slide, please. I know that I don't have much time, but I would also like to add that with changing times in machinery and technology, systems needs to be revised. So a lot of times we're accustomed to one sort of system of creating different protected areas, for example, and also probably even in the management of these protected areas. So sometimes we need to evolve with this evolving time that we have. We need to change the way that we approach things. So indigenous peoples should not be the last people to know what the changes are, what changes are coming, but should be part of that change. They are the ones that had answers in the past that can still be used today because of their natural existence with nature. So we need to, I mentioned those organizations earlier. One of the things that I put those organizations there is because they may have made mistakes during the process that had happened. But today, there are other organizations and even governments that are creating protected areas. And let us not continue those same mistakes over and over again. Let us try to learn from the mistakes that has happened in the past and move forward, and please include indigenous peoples in all the decision making, because if you cannot communicate with them, there will always be illegal mining, there will always be illegal logging, and those sort of things, because people do get angry in the end. So next slide, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jessica, for this fascinating insights from your country and from yourself as well as an indigenous persons. We take your message, and I think in general, IUCN, we're at the World Conservation Congress, and all the organizations of conservation should take your message seriously. And now I want to introduce the last speaker of today. And after we have a time for some questions. Our last speaker is a partner of ACT. It's Arnaud Ancelin. He's Deputy Director of Parque Amazonien de la Guyane, a large park. He will explain everything, where he will give his point of view on how the park has managed this whole issue on protected areas and indigenous peoples. Arnaud, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dominique. So I will give you an overview of the work of the national park in French Guiana. So French Guiana is, next slide, please. So French Guiana is a French overseas territory. So it is French. And France is a rather centralized country, and the constitution actually prevents from giving special rights on an ethnic base. So what is interesting with the experience of the national park is that in this particular context, there was a possibility to make experiences, make tries, in that field of working with indigenous people, and that's what I will now present. Next slide, please. So this is the national park here. So it was created in 2007 after like 15 years of work to prepare the creation of these huge protected areas, which covers about 3.4 million hectares. There is a core zone of 2 million hectares with a special regulation. And there is a buffer zone where normal legal framework applies. There are no additional regulation in that buffer zone. We have about 86 permanent staff. And as you see, this national park covers like 1/3 of French Guiana. Next slide, please. So there is an exceptional biodiversity like elsewhere in the Guiana Shield. It's still a very well preserved, forest. Although there is the threat of illegal gold mining very present in French Guiana. Next slide. There is a very rich cultural heritage. If you click, please, there is about 20,000 people living in the national park and right around it. Some of those people are Afro descendant, either Maroons or Creole people, and also indigenous people from 3 different communities: Guyana on the Maroon side, and Wayampi and Teco on the Oyapock side at the border with Brazil. So many languages spoken, more than 10 languages. So that's a very rich heritage that was taken into account when the protected area was created. Next, please. So local people were taken into account from the very beginning. Click, please. So when the protected area was created, specific provisions were set for the communities of inhabitants who traditionally derive their livelihood from the forest, which means that even in the core area, all those communities kept totally free access to the national park, they were allowed to go on with their traditional activities, agriculture, domestication of wild animals, hunting, fishing, even maintaining and creating new villages. All those activities are allowed even in the core area. They can gather also plants and herbs and etc. So that was very different from the other, the 9 other national parks that were created in France, even in some overseas territories before. So that's they're very specific, and the national park could not have been created without taking into account the people living there. Next, please. The management board, actually the national park is a public body with a board that includes civil servants, representatives from the civil society, elected people, and traditional chiefs who were integrated into the board from the very beginning. There is the board, there is a scientific committee, and there is also a local life committee that was set, which has only an advisory rule. But this is very important to guide us because it's composed of inhabitants. And this really leads us in the decisions that we take. And that's another, apart from the board, which has a very formal objective. The local life committee can be sized on many issues regarding the work of the national park and all the questions linked with the livelihoods into the national park. A great proportion of the staff was hired from local communities. About 2/3 of the staff is from French Guyanese origin. Next, please. And you can see here meetings from the local life committee. Next slide. After a few years, after the creation of the national park, we set a charter. The charter is the project of the territory. It took also a long time to set, the general objectives of this document, which is really a strategic document for the next 12 years. And in this charter, of course, preservation of biodiversity is important. There is also a big stake about bringing public services in the territory of South Guyana. But also there is some very important stress that was set on those issues, the issue of local communities, of cultural heritage, preservation, transmission of traditional knowledge, and also to promote the cultures of this territory. Next slide. So now examples, because the charter is still something, it's kind of some formal strategic document. So a few examples. We have the protected areas supporting the study and registering of the great Wayampi songs from Troisseau. So this is a big work of recording, of translating, and also work to foster transmission. So the next example is a Teco dictionary, the Teco language. Like 40 years ago, it was only still spoken with by about 50 speakers. So it could have disappeared. So now it's very important also to have tools such as a Teco-French dictionary. These two projects, they are not undertaken directly by the national park, but supported by the national park with facilitation for the NGOs and project holders who do this work. The next project, next slide. The other example it concerns the rehabilitation of traditional Maroon houses in the village of Papayashton. So you can see here those traditional houses, very emblematic of this culture. But as you can see, it was in a poor state of conservation. So there was an inventory that was done by the staff of the national park that this is almost 10 years ago, diagnosis by an architect from the direction of cultural affairs. There was mediation work, and then the renovation of houses could start. So we have now renewed the first 6 houses. Next, please. So you can see the same houses, you know, before and after, and this contributes to maintaining this knowledge, you know, who like those paintings is called tembe painting, and this is also something that can be maintained through this kind of project. Next, please. Other examples, it concerns the importance of transmission of traditions. So we do some work in schools, hiring local languages storytellers. Next, please. And also transmission of traditional activities like cotton and Arrouman is a plant that is used for arts craft, and this is done in school with you know, I don't know how to say that, people who still have this knowledge that will do this transmission work towards the students. Next, please. So another important issue is free prior informed consent, and the national park was also a place of experimentation because since the very beginning, in 2007, when the national park was created, there was disposition which imply that access to genetic resources and traditional knowledge within the protected areas was subject to a regulation. You needed a permit to access to genetic resources and traditional knowledge since the creation of the national park. This was not the case elsewhere in French Guyana. And then in 2016, there is a French law on biodiversity that formalized the access to genetic resources at the national level. And then since 2019, the French Guyana, due to that experience, because in that time, our scientific committee worked on this issue. They produced a guide for good practices concerning access to genetic resources. This phase was also a way to make understand why access to genetic resources needs to be done in another way, respecting the local communities. And then in the past few years, the French Guyanese Amazonian Park was designated to ensure that indigenous and Maroon people are well consulted before access to their traditional knowledge. So in a way, the national park guarantees that this is being done properly. We are not delivering the authorization. This is being done by the Ministry of Environment at last, but the French Guyanese National Park rule is to organize the consultation and guarantee that it was done properly. So we have here two examples of projects that included access to traditional knowledge, and the staff of the Parque Amazonia, with the participation of the project initiators, did this consultation, and then the transcript of all this process is sent to the French ministry, which at last takes the decision to allow or not the project. Next, please. So a big effort is done on participatory sciences. A good example is the Parque Amazonia game program that took place between 2010 and 2012. So the Parque's game program was a study on hunting practices of local communities. So more than 600 hunters accepted to provide information to the national park. So that was a huge database. Next, please, including documentation of around 30,000 catches that were registered. And all this work, including actually data on hunting of normally protected species, like here the spider monkey, it means that you need really a good trust with the hunters if you want them to even speak about that. So that was the case thanks to a very close relation with them. And the results of this program, and there was a similar fishing program, have contributed to the establishment of red lists for mammals, bird, reptiles, and fishes in French Guyana. Next, please. And then after this first step was, description of practices. Then the next step was really towards, even closer towards co-management with the Terra Makandi program that is now finishing at the moment, which really aims at co-establishing management rules with the local communities. So it was done on 4 territories inside the national park, concerning about 11,000 people. 7 mediators were hired from the local communities for this program. You can see them on the picture. And it was really a participatory approach. So first of all, there was a diagnosis that was done by the local communities, held by the mediators. So it's the local communities themselves who said, okay, we have this or that preoccupation, this or that problem concerning maybe scarcity of some natural resources. Then the potential solution, next please, were identified by the communities themselves. And then the role of the national park is to accompany the local communities in setting those solutions. Next, please. And next slide. So a few examples is the Arouman plant that was that happened to be become rare in Troisseau, which is a village on the Oyapock River, and the people asked the park, but maybe it could be a good idea to plant them to have this resource again close to our villages. So that was made and done by the villagers themselves with the help of in terms of logistics and financing of the national park. And another example is to help the Aluku, which is a Maroon community, to establish a file asking for an exemption so that they would be allowed to hunt the spider monkey, which is some very important element of some mourning ceremonies. At the moment, it is strictly forbidden, and then the national park can play a role to make the legal framework make a footstep towards the community and try to find some harmony for that particular species. So that was a brief overview of the work being done, which really does not pretend to be the right way to do things. We are constantly doing experiments and tries, and this is and all those governance issues are still a very sensitive topic. But with the example, with all the work that we do, we also hope that the lessons learned can be disseminated and used in the broader framework of French Guiana and overseas territory. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arnaud, for this insights from your country, from French Guiana, from the Parque Amazonien. Even for me, it was really interesting to hear how the park has consulted and how they have changed their attitude towards this issue. Before inviting everybody to the drinks, of course, I would like to invite everybody for asking questions. Questions to Isidoro, to Jessica, to Arnaud. I have a lot of questions. There's a very vast topic has been introduced here. And we have got 4 excellent speakers from 4 different countries with with different settings in each country, and fascinating to learn about that. For the wider community of conservation, including IUCN, which is heading towards 30% of protected areas in 2030. So it's a question of including indigenous territories and learning from everything which has happened in the past. And we all know in the Americas, and especially in Brazil, Colombia, most of the indigenous territories have been installed. So we had a glimpse of information from Colombia, Brazil, Guyana, French Guiana. I want to ask people who have a question now to Jessica, Arnaud, Isidoro, Sandra. Please take the mic or come here and raise your question. Also IUCN, if there are questions towards the speakers.
Okay, is it all right? Yes, it seems to be all right. Okay, thank you very much for all the presentation. This was really interesting. Yes, it's okay. Okay, and okay, so I have many questions, but I think I will try to be very short because there is a lot of stuff. But first of all, I would have a remark for France, because effectively Arnaud said that the Constitution prevents recognition for the indigenous people. Maybe the indigenous problematic or thematic would be a good driver for France to change its Constitution and go a bit further to respect also the what the President of French Republic said on the aperture of the Congress. It would be very interesting. Maybe it's a bit bold. So I don't know if this is really a question, but just a personal remark. I'm French, by the way. Maybe you noticed because of my English. Sorry for that. Isidoro said that Colombia was a bit far away from the rest of the Guiana Shield and so on. And maybe there is a remark here. As I come from French Guiana also, I think that sometimes we're a bit enclosed in French Guiana and we cannot discuss so much with the rest of the Guianas. it's a bit a pity, but I would like to know what could reinforce this kind of communication. For instance, maybe we can reinforce, I don't know, standardization of the indigenous culture. I don't know how we can shift this kind of power. Maybe you've got answers for that to indicate how we can maybe redesign the world according to more indigenous standard and spirituality as well. I think I will end here. Thank you.
Isidoro, you want to start?
Yes, certainly. That's a great question by one of the audience members. It's certainly the issue of how do these countries identify themselves? And Colombia has historically identified itself as an Andean nation due to most of its population living in the Andes. I, for example, am from the Caribbean region, and there's multiple regions in Colombia. And it really starts from the country itself rather than something imposed from above. It centers really on how Colombia historically has been a very centralized state, similar to the French state. And it's giving more power to the local citizens in the Guyanese highlands of Colombia, and also educating decision makers. I think most people are not aware that the Guyanese region of Colombia is so vast, similar to the Amazon region of Colombia and their overlap. I think most people are not aware that the Amazon biome in Colombia is almost half of the country. And it's really lack of awareness raising, of really identifying ourselves as a Guyanese country or an Amazonian country, of where we state our priorities as a nation, as a country. And it's, I think, in part, educational awareness raising with decision makers and seeing the potential there of understanding the country as part of all these different regions, not just one, and increasing communications with other states in the area. That's fundamental. And last but not least, actually fundamental, there's also promoting the exchanges between local communities and indigenous peoples in these areas to understand how they can support each other and promote land rights and conservation of ecosystems. But it's certainly a challenge. Like the audience member mentioned, most people don't know that Colombia has even a Guyana, or it's considered part of the Guyanese highlands. So, thank you.
Thank you, Isidoro. I want to give the floor to Arnaud, as a French citizen and also Deputy Director of French Guiana National Park in La Guyane. Rephrasing a little bit the question, of course, of our friend in the back is coming not from France. You know that a lot of people in the area, in the Amazon and in the Guyanas, they know that Suriname and French Guiana is the last one in the South American region not to have recognized indigenous rights and indigenous lands. How do you see that? Is there an evolution? Has President Macron given some attention to this? How do you see that and the pressure from the other people? Thank you.
Okay. Actually, there were very important social movements in French Guiana in 2017, and there was a commitment. There was a treaty that was signed to seize this big movement, including the transfer of 400,000 hectares to indigenous communities. So now this process is not very far, but anyway, this is some commitment. So something will have to be done. What I would mention about what is complicated with French Guiana. There is a paradox because there are many footsteps, many attention actually to indigenous people, but this does not go until the process of transferring of land rights. There are some zones in French Guiana which is a kind of recognition of uses, but this is not at all transferring in full property land to indigenous people. So I don't know if a change in the constitution can be made. This is very political, but there is, yes, this paradox of many things being done, but you're just in the middle. You don't go the whole way towards really recognizing rights. There are some small patches, and the regulation of the national park itself is already something special, with special rights given to Amerindian and Maroon people. So from this example, for sure we need to go further. So I think the example of the national park can also be an example that shows that there is no fear. There is nothing to be afraid of. This is possible, and that's what we try to do.
Thank you so much, Arnaud. Please take the floor, or you can come here as well if you want, or just turn the mic maybe. Turn the mic.
Hello, my name is Isabella. I'm from Colombia. So I also work in Colombia with 2 organizations. And I pose this question because it's something that really hits home. And many activists, as well as indigenous leaders in Colombia and in Brazil, are being assassinated for speaking out, for protecting land, for protecting their rights, talking about human rights, defending their rights as indigenous peoples to have autonomy, as well as talking about what is really going on in these really difficult places and the post-conflict in Colombia, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. How do you navigate this, and how do you continue to inspire the next generation to not be fearful and to continue this fight?
So thank you, Isabella. That's certainly a fundamental question to the issue of indigenous rights, rights to land, and also environmental defenders, not only local community members, but several members of the park system have also been threatened, and some of them have been killed as well. Just at the start of 2020, coincidentally, even before COVID-19 began, many members of the national park system of the Colombian Amazon had to leave their posts because of threats to their lives. But may the parks leave, but the indigenous peoples and local communities are there, ever present, and are certainly suffering the most of the impacts from these pressures stemming from the post-conflict and other issues. The work with youth is fundamental, educating them on their traditions, on the importance of their ecosystems, on the importance of their language. Is crucial, that aspect of working with youth, and ACT has begun working with youth with several actors such as the Constitutional Court of Colombia, promoting awareness in youth of the importance of nature, of importance of indigenous peoples as well, changing that mindset that not only within the indigenous communities themselves, but as population as a whole, as South America is an example of increasing polarization, that in strengthening inclusion, strengthening, lessening discrimination is more and more fundamental. As you know, many of these indigenous peoples and Afro-Colombian communities are discriminated against, and there's many views of misconceptions of who they are and what their rights to land implicate. So that's a fundamental aspect, as you mentioned. Ultimately, there's many things that we can do, but supporting communities on the ground, raising awareness of this issue, trying to not be desensitized, I think, is fundamental. As people that work in this issue, we hear about assassination attempts and threats constantly, but it's trying to not be desensitized or demoralized. This work is really intergenerational. It's not just going to shift in 1 year, but as we've seen in Colombia, there can be some positive effects, some positive results ultimately if we continue the work in the long term and not give up, and promote the rights to indigenous peoples and local communities to their lands. Certainly not an easy question. And as you say, Brazil and Colombia are certainly the hot spots in terms of threats and murders to environmental defenders. And it's just, long-term support, understanding that this is not something that's going to end in 2-3 years, but it's really intergenerational, decades of support on the ground.
Thank you, Isidoro, for your reply. We're going over time. I'm sure all of you are thirsty. I still have maybe 5 minutes for last question, if there is one, and then a very short reply before we end up in this session. Yes.
Hello, I am a Brazilian anthropologist. I would like also to add to that question. I was shocked today that I was following the debates on the indigenous people, and then a Palicor lady from the French Guyana, she stood up and she said, I'm here in this Congress invited by COICA, the Cuenca de las Organizaciones Indígenas de la Amazonía, and not by the French government. And I was shocked because as a Brazilian, and believe me, we are in deep conflict and problem at the moment there. But even there, with Bolsonaro in the presidency, the indigenous people keep on marching in Brasilia, but they are recognized as identity and they are minority. And like our Makushi friend who spoke here, I don't know by who she was invited, but the Paluca lady, she was invited by an indigenous organization with all the difficulties to get finance, and not by the French government who is using it as big platform. And I like Macron when he faces Bolsonaro, but I don't like Macron when he doesn't admit that Palicor are an indigenous minority and they deserve to have all the international human rights protection. So that's a question. Why not here in the IUCN make this decision, Minister or dear President?
Thank you. I'm not sure if this is a question or a comment. I don't think so. It's up to Arnaud to, but if you want to give a comment on this, you're free. It's fine.
I will, well, I don't represent national authorities, huh? But I think there is, I think France has a lot to, and in French Guiana, we have a lot to learn from the neighboring countries. In terms of empowerment, in terms of recognition of local communities. So what you mentioned, I know we have also there are some people here invited by WWF and actually other stakeholders, but I think it is not obvious actually it is not obvious in France, the link between local communities, indigenous communities, and biodiversity issues. So because French Guiana also is very far, is not well known. So there is all this context actually but for sure we can do far better in the future. But honestly, we try to. I think Parque Amazonia is, again, it's not a perfect example, but I know very well other projects in French Guiana, and it's really scientific. It's really usually a scientific vision. So all that we are discussing now, it is something quite new, actually, and the link that is obvious for all of us here between indigenous communities and the resilience of ecosystems and other ways to protect biodiversity, which are different from setting a regulation or setting a protected area. This is still quite new, so that probably explains the situation.
Thank you, Arnaud, for the last words. I will finalize by saying thank you so much to the speakers. I think we had a wonderful session. Thank you, Isidoro in the US, and thank you, Sandra in Brazil. Thank you, Arnaud, for giving your point of view, and from Parque Amazonia. Thank you, Jessica, for giving the point of view. I really think when I discuss this issue with IUCN Netherlands, I want to thank them as well as the host. When IUCN is heading towards 30% protected areas in 2030, there's also a lot of work to do within the conservation world. Thinking about indigenous issues, how we work with these people, how central land is for them, how many land already protected by indigenous peoples, and what we learned today from 4 different countries. Such a variety of lessons we can take home is really incredible. So with this, I would like to invite all of you to the drink. Just one last comment. ACT is a small, medium-sized NGO. We have a booth here if you want to visit us. And we also have a press conference tomorrow on the importance of the Guiana Shield and the threats facing the Guiana Shield. Thank you so much.